Following his victory at Brandywine on September 11, 1777, British General William Howe felt the time was now ripe to march on the Patriot stronghold of Philadelphia. At the time, Philadelphia was one of the largest cities in the colonies, and by reason of being the home of the Congress, the effective de facto capital of the fledgling United States. Howe hoped that seizing it would be a devastating psychological blow that would extinguish the rebellion completely. Accordingly, Howe began to move on the city. George Washington, commanding an outnumbered Continental army, moved to block him. Howe was a skillful soldier, however, and by adroit manoeuvring levered Washington out of one position after another. The only significant clash came when Washington deployed Wayne's division, about 1,500 men, as a rearguard near the Schuylkill River, with orders to delay the British and, if possible, attack their supply columns. British scouts detected this detachment, and Howe ordered Major General Charles Grey to attack it. Wayne's own scouts detected the incoming British force, and he duly formed up his troops in a defensive position at Powley, but a well-executed night attack on September 20th-21st completely routed his division. Howe marched on, continuing to outmaneuver Washington, and entered Philadelphia without having to fight a battle on September 26, 1777. A year earlier this would have been a devastating blow to the rebellion, but in fact Patriot morale remained surprisingly high. Seizing the city by pure manoeuvre meant that Washington's Continental Army was still intact, and there had been plenty of time to evacuate the Congress, and indeed any civilian who wished to leave the city. Besides, there had been good news for the Patriots in New York State, where a British force under Burgoyne was struggling, eventually leading to the defeat at Saratoga. The intended psychological effect of capturing Philadelphia had not materialised, and now Howe had to face the adverse consequences of his actions. Advancing to Philadelphia had significantly stretched his communications. Ideally, supplies had been sent down the Delaware River, but Patriot control of the Fort Island Battery and Forts Mercer and Billingsport barred this passage, and so everything had to be brought overland from Elkstown. Howe was forced to detach 3,000 troops to guard these supply lines, and 3,000 more were garrisoning Philadelphia itself. 2 more battalions were detached to attempt to capture Billingsport. Howe deployed the remainder of his army north of Philadelphia at the village of Germantown. Germantown was a hamlet of small stone houses spread over 2 miles along both sides of the Skippack Road, although the majority of the main buildings were to the west of it. Howe's encampment was to the south of the village upon some slightly raised ground. On his left was Kniphausen's division, about 3,000 strong, consisting of 2 British brigades under Grey and Agnew, and a Hessian brigade under Sturm. A regiment of Hessian Jägers, light infantry, under Wurmb, protected the extreme left. To the right of the main Chestnut Hill Road, under the direct command of Howe himself, were 2 brigades under Grant and the Guards Brigade under Matthew, each about 1,000 strong. Also present were 2 battalions worth of grenadiers, culled from the infantry regiments, under the command of Monckton. Finally, on the extreme right was a Loyalist militia light infantry unit, the Queen's Rangers, and 2 small troops of dragoons, totalling about 500. Howe covered his front with a hefty skirmish screen, consisting of 3 whole regiments of light infantry under the command of William Erskine, deployed all across the north of the village. All told, Howe had about 9,000 troops in and around Germantown. Washington had pulled his army back to the Skippack Creek, some 25 miles from Philadelphia. He saw this diffusion of British strength as an opportunity to strike. By concentrating all his Continentals and summoning as many militiamen as were nearby, he managed to muster a combined force of just over 11,000. He broke camp at midday on October 3rd and began to move toward Germantown. Washington's plan for the forthcoming battle was extremely ambitious, especially for a general with a reputation for caution. It called for a simultaneous dawn assault by 4 separate attack columns over a front of some 7 miles. There were 2 advantages to doing it this way. Firstly, the Americans would be able to advance along 4 separate roads, which would reduce congestion and enable them to get into position faster. Secondly, it would stretch the defenders out into a long line too, which would increase the chance of being able to make a breakthrough. However, there were also problems. At a time without GPS, radios, telephones or even telegraph communications, coordinating such an attack would have been a tall order even for an experienced veteran force, and Washington's army was far from that. Although the majority of his troops were Continental regulars, most of them were quite raw. Washington attempted to obviate the worst effects of this by stationing himself in the centre near the two main attack columns, but even so, ensuring that the assaults would be made simultaneously was going to be challenging, particularly as the approach march was long and would be made at night. Washington's columns reached their jump-off points in the evening of October the 3rd and began to move forward to the attack. On his left flank, Foreman's New Jersey Militia Brigade and Smallwood's Maryland Militia Brigade, each about 750 strong, were to march along the Old York Road and attack the British right rear. Next to them was Greene and Stevens divisions of Continentals, each about 1,500 strong, together with an independent brigade under McDougall, about 1,000 strong. They were to march along the Lime Kiln Road and attack the British right centre. The third column was led by Sullivan's division, 1,000 troops, and Wayne's battered but still large division, about 2,000 strong. They were to move along the main Skippack Road and attack up the Chestnut Hill Road directly into the British encampment. Finally, on the American right, Armstrong's brigade of 1,500 Pennsylvania militia, with a battery of light guns, was to advance along the Manatawny Road and attack the British left flank. Alexander's division, consisting of the brigades of Nash and Maxwell, were kept in reserve. They totalled 1,200 troops and 2 cannon. The intention was that the main attack would be made by the central columns, which would either shatter the British line or force them to pull all their forces in to hold the position, which would allow the flanking columns to sweep in and encircle them. Inevitably, moving large numbers of men and lots of heavy equipment in the dark led to considerable confusion, and this only got worse when a thick fog blanketed the area just before dawn. This mist both helped and hampered the Patriots. On the plus side, it obscured their approach from the pickets Howe were deployed north of the village, enabling the attack columns to get close to the main British positions undetected. On the downside, it further disrupted timing and coordination. At dawn, only Sullivan's division, leading the centre-right column, was in position. All the others were lagging well behind, particularly Greene's division on the Lime Kiln Road, who had gotten lost in the fog. Moreover, the British soon became aware of the presence of their adversaries. Opposing patrols exchanged sporadic fire in the early hours, and by 3 a.m. Howe was informed that enemy troops were in the vicinity, although due to the thick fog he believed they were probably only raiding parties and not the entire Continental Army bearing down on him. Nonetheless, he acted with commendable speed and ordered his entire force to stand to, although some units seemed not to have received the message, or at least didn't act upon it. Sullivan's central column was the first to make contact. At about 0500, just after dawn, its lead elements clashed with the British pickets at Mount Airy. The British were initially surprised, but they put up a good fight, and it took a substantial part of Sullivan's division to finally overwhelm and drive them back into Germantown proper. Howe himself had ridden forward, and still thinking his pickets were only being attacked by foraging parties or skirmishers, ordered them to hold their ground. Just as he was berating the pickets for retreating, 3 American guns opened fire with grape shot, and Howe was lucky not to be hit. He swiftly scampered out of range, thoroughly disabused of the notion that he was only facing light opposition. By mid-morning the British light infantry screen had been routed, and Sullivan's division had reached the centre of Germantown itself, but then they hit an obstacle. Colonel Musgrave of the British 40th Foot had moved 6 companies into a large house just to the east of the Skippack Road called Cliveden. Owned by a well-known local loyalist called Benjamin Chew, the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, this large brick mansion was a natural fortress. From Cliveden, Musgrave was able to bring considerable fire into Sullivan's division as it pressed forward. There is some dispute as to just how many men Musgrave managed to ensconce within the house. A British light infantry company theoretically had a strength of between 100 to 150 troops, but in practice units active in the field would have been very under strength, and many casualties had already been suffered in the preceding fight. Musgrave probably had no more than 150 men in total. Nonetheless, the fire from the house was very disruptive, and Washington called a hurried council of war to decide what to do about it. Some of his subordinates favoured bypassing the mansion, leaving a regiment behind to besiege it. However, Washington's artillery commander, Brigadier General Henry Knox, thought it unwise to allow a fortified enemy garrison in the rear of a forward advance. After some thought, Washington concurred. He ordered General William Maxwell's brigade forward to storm Cliveden, while Knox positioned 4 3-pounder cannon out of musket range to bombard the mansion. However, the thick walls withstood the bombardment, and the defenders easily repulsed the infantry assault. The Americans launched a second wave of infantry attacks, but these fared no better. The few Continentals who managed to get inside the mansion were shot or bayoneted. A third attempt was made to dislodge the defenders by setting light to firewood at the door and smoking them out, but the fire did not catch. It was clear now that storming Cliveden was not going to be easy, but there was a greater price to be paid than the not inconsiderable casualties. The redirection of effort away from the main thrust slowed and disrupted the American advance, giving the British time to reorganise their defences and prepare a counterattack. With the morning wearing on, the situation was this. On the American right, Armstrong's militia had advanced to the confluence of the Wissahickon Creek and Schuylkill River. There on the cliffs, the militia set up their artillery and began a desultory bombardment, but made no effort to advance on the Hessian Jaeger. The outnumbered Hessians saw no point in moving to engage either, and so both sides simply glared at each other. Sullivan's division, helped by some of Wayne's troops, had pushed on several hundred yards beyond the village and made contact with the main British defence line. As they advanced, they periodically halted and fired volleys into the fog ahead. This suppressed opposition very effectively, but it also used up a lot of ammunition, and Sullivan's men began to run short. On their left, Greene's column on Lime Kiln Road had finally caught up and engaged the British pickets at Lucan's Mill, driving them back after a vicious skirmish. On the far left, Smallwood and Foreman's militia brigades were still lagging behind. The battle seemed to be reaching a critical point where the main trial of strength was about to begin, but then the American attack was suddenly stymied by a tragic event. Although the early morning fog was beginning to burn off, smoke from musket and cannon discharges had more than supplemented it. With visibility now very low, the Patriot units following up the attack columns became disorientated and distracted by the heavy fire still reverberating around Cliveden. Stevens' brigade headed towards the sound of the guns along Meeting House Road, instead of rendezvousing at Market Square with the rest of Greene's troops. The wayward brigade collided with one of Wayne's brigades, mistook them for redcoats, and opened fire. Wayne's men fired back, and in the confusion both American units routed off the field. Stephen, who was allegedly intoxicated, would later be court-martialed and dismissed from the army for his conduct during the battle. This friendly fire incident completely robbed the American attack of its impetus. Sullivan's men were already worried by their rapidly depleting ammunition supply, and now with the sounds of battle behind them at Cliveden and no clear command coordination, they began to waver. Howe, meanwhile, had rallied his troops and began a determined counterattack, pushing the disorientated Americans back. Sullivan could have been in trouble, but instead of pressing them, the British swung to the right and moved to outflank Greene's column, allowing Sullivan to disengage successfully. Greene had another problem. With Smallwood's column still nowhere in sight, the British Grenadier battalions and the Loyalist Queen's Rangers moved up to attack MacDougall's brigade on their left flank, inflicting heavy casualties. By early afternoon it was clear to Washington that the fight was turning against him. He decided to cut his losses and ordered a general retreat. Not all of Greene's troops thought the battle was lost. The 9th Virginia Regiment of Greene's column launched a determined attack on the British lines as planned. They actually managed to break through and capture a number of prisoners. However, they were soon surrounded by British reinforcements, and the entire regiment was forced to surrender. Greene, learning of the main army's withdrawal, realised he was standing alone against Howe's entire army, and so also withdrew. Howe ordered a pursuit with fresh troops, trying to harry the retreating Americans, but the retreat was quite orderly. Both sides were by now very tired, and the still thick fog, the onset of night, and fierce resistance from Greene's Continentals and especially the American artillery enabled Washington to disengage successfully. The Patriots rallied at Perkiomen Creek near present-day White Marsh. Howe returned to Germantown. The battle had lasted all day. Washington's total losses came to 1,100, or about 10% of his army. 150 were killed, between 500 and 550 were wounded, and between 400 to 450 were listed as missing, mostly taken prisoner. There were marked variations in the distribution of losses. The Continentals took the brunt of it, and officer casualties were particularly heavy. Over a third of the American dead were killed attacking Cliveden House, a testimony to the ferocity of the fighting there. Howe recorded losses of about 70 killed, 450 wounded, and 15 missing, or about half that of the Patriots. Tactically, therefore, Germantown was a clear British Loyalist victory. They had repulsed a numerically superior force, retained possession of the field, and inflicted twice the losses they had sustained. Washington's ambitious but complex plan to reverse the strategic momentum of the British had clearly failed, and the Patriot centre at Philadelphia remained firmly in Loyalist hands. Yet, curiously, from a strategic point of view, Germantown was a Patriot victory. So how did this come about? How did the losers win? In the first place, Howe did not follow up his victory by immediately driving at Washington's army, preferring instead to secure his supply lines by clearing the forts on the Delaware River. It was only then that he moved forward, attempting to entice Washington into combat at White Marsh. Washington refused to be drawn and pulled back to Valley Forge to overwinter, whereupon Howe withdrew to Philadelphia. The Continental Army therefore remained a force in being. Despite the obvious tactical defeat, many in both the Army and the US Congress viewed the battle as a moral victory. Morale certainly remained high. Most of the American generals, Washington, Greene, Sullivan, and even Wayne, were acknowledged as performing very credibly. It was only Adam Stephen that was censured. Secondly, the defeat showed up serious deficiencies in the Patriot Army, particularly in its coordination, command structure, and battlefield discipline. Militia performance in particular was very mixed. Americans have always been good at learning from their mistakes, and the respite at Valley Forge was used to good effect to address these problems. The army was intensively retrained over winter to a much more professional standard. It would emerge as a formidable force in the new year. Most importantly of all, the battle significantly shifted perceptions about the capabilities and resolve of the Patriot cause. That the Americans had lost the battle proved to be less important than the fact that they had fought it at all. To attempt such a complex attack plan, and to nearly succeed, impressed many European observers, particularly the French. Combined with the American victory at Saratoga, Germantown helped convince the French that the Patriots were capable of challenging the British army effectively and were therefore worth helping. This perception contributed to a formal alliance in 1778, and that was to prove ultimately decisive in turning the tide of the Revolutionary War.